Hi, it's Sherri from A Quilting Life, and I'm here today to share the March block of the month. And it's an Ohio Star variation. I think you'll find it a little bit more simple than last month's block, but I still have lots of tips and tricks to share to make your block construction process just a little bit easier. Let's get started. Okay, so we're going to get started. I'm going to show you step by step how to make this month's blocks. I am going to be making my small version Christmas block, the 6-inch finished, at the same time, but I'm only going to demonstrate with my 12-inch pieces. So first, let me just tell you, this one can be a little bit confusing because we have background squares that are in two sizes and they're close enough that I want to make sure that you get them separated right away. So your A piece is the 4 center squares. They're 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch for the 12-inch block, and they are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches for the smaller block. And then your B is your center, and so that's a 4.5 inch square for the 12-inch block, and it's a 2.5 inch square for the 6-inch block. So notice these are all the same size. Okay, your light C is the other background square, but it's larger than these. So this is 5 1/4 by 5 1/4 for the 12-inch blocks. And then D, you'll need 2 5 1/4 by 5 1/4, and E is kind of a middle of the road print, 5 1/4 by 5 1/4. And then for the 6-inch blocks, those are 3 1/4 of an inch. So I'm using the 2 green and the low volume and then the light. Okay, and then for each block you need 4 squares for the outer corners, and for the 12-inch block those are 3 by 3, and for the 6-inch block those are 1 3/4 by 1 3/4. Okay, what we're going to do is we are going to make the 4 outer corner sections first so that we get these background squares separated. So take your smaller background squares and your small print squares, and we're going to put those together for now. And we're going to keep the single background square that is the same size as 3 other squares. We're going to keep that separated. Okay, so you have basically 2 methods you can use to do this. The pattern directions show you drawing a diagonal line. I'm actually going to show both methods. They show you drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side of your outer corners fabrics. And I like these sew line pencils. They just glide on the fabric. And they have you putting it right sides together on one of the background squares. And you're going to sew just inside that line, and then you'll trim a 1/4 inch seam allowance and press out. The other method, and this is how I'm going to do all of my other corners because it's so much faster, is that you simply line these up . And then for this method, I'm going to use the mini simple folded corners ruler. And with this ruler, you don't need a pencil. You can just line everything up. And I do have a video just on using this ruler that you can watch. And you're actually going to cut, and then you're going to go sew your 1/4 inch seam. And what I really do is I will cut all of these at once. And I will line them up so I can just chain piece them. Okay, I'm back from the sewing machine and the ironing board. And the 3 that I put together using the simple folded corners ruler method are all done. They're all pressed, they're complete. I use that method for my Christmas version as well. Now this one I pressed. I do like to go ahead and press while that fabric is still there. It just seems to give it more stability. But now I will need to trim this. When you use the pencil method for these stitch and flip corners, you trim after you sew. So I've got this half square triangle that I will go ahead and sew together the next time I go to the machine, but I sewed these other ones while I was sewing all of this. So they're ready to go into my half square triangle basket, and I'll trim them to whatever size I end up using them for later. So those I'll set aside, and we're done with this ruler. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make our center sections for the outside part of the block. I'll set this aside because it's actually ready as is, and these are all ready too. So we've got 5 out of our 9 units just ready to go. Okay, so these blocks, squares, are all going to get cut in half on the diagonal twice so that they make 4 triangles. And if your rotary blade is sharp and you feel good about your cutting, you can go ahead and stack them all up and cut them together. That's what I usually do. Don't do it if your blade's not sharp, because then they might get messed up. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut diagonally twice. I'm going to take the ruler, I'm going to line it up with both of these opposite corners. Okay, and I'm not going to touch them. I'm going to reposition my ruler. And it helps if you have a turning board. This one I can get without it. Okay, so I've cut all of those into 4 triangles. And what we're going to do now is we're going to lay it out to make our block. And you're going to make 4 actual identical blocks, and then we'll be turning them in different directions. Now, as you put these triangles into piles, just be careful with them. Don't stretch them. They do have the bias sides. Okay, so the block goes together with the 2 lights across from each other and the 2 that match across from each other. So I'm just going to go ahead and stack them all up, because all 4 of these units will end up being the same. Okay, and it really doesn't matter. You're going to sew them together in pairs, and it honestly doesn't matter which pairs you sew together, because it's going to go together to create a square no matter what. But generally what I will do is just take 2 and 2. Then you're going to put them right sides together, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. And I will chain piece these. I will put them all stacked up and take them over to the sewing machine and chain piece them. And these are the same way. Make sure you keep them lined up how you had them. Okay, I'm going to go sew these in using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I usually set them on a project board or a ruler to take them over to the sewing machine. And you will be sewing that 1/4 inch seam and pressing to the dark. So for both of those units, you're going to be pressing to the darker fabric. And I'll come back and show you the next step. Okay, I'm back from the sewing machine. You'll notice that you have 2 different kinds of triangle pairs. One with your background and one with your 2 prints. So background and print, and that same print with the other print. So I've got those. And remember also, you pressed all of those toward the darker fabric. So They're all pressed toward the darker fabric. And now we're going to put them together with the prints opposite each other. And what is going to happen is those seams are going to nest together nicely. So I will generally, it's up to you if you need to stick a pin in there. If you're a newer sewer, I would suggest maybe a pin at the beginning and a pin at the end and a pin at the seam. I will generally just line these all up as well as I can on a design board so that they don't shift. And I'll take them over to the sewing machine like this. And I'll just sew this seam with a 1/4 inch seam. Now these units are being made slightly oversized, so we are going to trim them. And I'm just going to go ahead and line up my little 6-inch sections as well. And I'll take them all over to the machine and sew them and come back, and then I will show you how to trim these little units so that they are just the right size for your block. Okay, we're getting close to being finished. I actually went and pressed all of the pieces for my large block, but I left one unpressed from the small block because I wanted to show you something. When you press, you have a few different options. You can take this seam and you can press it to one side or the other. That's fine. You can also press it open if you want. But there's another option that you can do. And if you press, it has a lot of different names. Spinning the center, flipping the center. But anyway, if you take one side and press it one direction and the other side and press it the other direction, it'll kind of naturally fall that way. It will make a cute little 4 patch in the center. It's a little bit harder to see with these fabrics. And then you can turn it over and you can press. And what it does is it makes that center seam a lot flatter, and I've done that with all of these. That's just the way I always press my 1/4 square triangles. But you don't have to do that. Some people really like to do it. I know quilters love it. When I say quilter, I mean the person who quilts your quilt will love it because your piece is more flat. Okay, after we've pressed, we're going to actually trim these. Remember, I mentioned before that they were a little bit oversized. So these need to be trimmed to measure 2.5 inches square, and they should be just slightly over that. And if you take any ruler with a diagonal line, you'll want to put, for these smaller pieces, the 1 1/4 inch right at the center. And you can take that diagonal line and line it up with one of the diagonal seams. And I will usually cut 2 sides at a time. And then I'll flip it and cut the other and make sure that that's just right at 2.5 inches. It's a little bit hard on this one to see. I've got green fabrics and other green fabrics. But anyway, I'll trim the rest of these off the camera. I'll show you how I'm going to do this one. And for the larger blocks, these are going to finish at 4.5, so you want the 2 1/4 inch mark at that center. And sometimes you're just trimming a little sliver. If you get to this point and you find out that your block is too small, that means your 1/4 inch seam allowance was too big. So if you've had trouble with this type of block before, or you haven't done them before, I would suggest maybe sewing one unit, pressing and trimming before moving on. The other thing that you can do is you can add a 1/4 of an inch to all of the squares before you cut them out. If you have trouble, you can add a 1/4 of an inch so that they're bigger when you begin, and that gives you more leeway to trim. Okay, so I've got those all trimmed, and now we're on to the fun part. We're actually ready to put this block together. So I'm going to grab a design board, and for my 12-inch block I'm going to lay it out on a large design board. And now we've got all of our pieces. I'm going to put the center piece, and then I'm going to put the corner pieces, making sure that our small pieces are on the 4 outer corners. And then when you add in these hourglass units, you're going to make sure that your background fabric is on the outside each time. So that what happens is that this other fabric, oh, see, I flipped that one wrong. Okay, so that the secondary light print surrounds your center block and your background fabrics are out at the outer edges. And then we're just going to go sew this together in 3 different rows. We're going to sew these 3 together, and I will press out towards the sides. We'll sew these 3 together, and I will press in toward the center. And with this outer unit, I'll again press out towards the ends. And I'll go sew those, and I'll sew my Christmas versions and be right back. Okay, I'm back from the sewing machine. I've got my block pieces sewn into 3 different rows. And as I mentioned, I pressed the pieces on the top and the bottom out. Press both of those out, and then I press the center section in. Now with this, just make sure, just double check before you sew your rows together that your little light print, that those pieces are all surrounding the center unit and that the outsides are all your background fabric. That's someplace where people sometimes get turned around. I already sewed my little 6-inch block together, and I pressed both of the rows in toward the center section because it had that dark piece. But again, you can press these rows open if you feel like that makes it flatter. You can press them down. I just, with all these white light background sections, I thought it was better to go in toward the middle. So I will go sew this one together, and then the block will be complete, and I'll come back and we'll close out the video. Okay, I'm back from the sewing machine, from the iron. I've got the larger block finished up. I pressed it the same way that I pressed the smaller block. And so now we are up to 3 blocks for our block of the month. I love how they're going together. This week's block was definitely, I think, a little bit more simple than especially last week's block with all of those half square triangles. Okay, so not week, month. Last month's block was the one with all of the half square triangles. And I feel like this month's block was quite a bit easier. This is a traditional Ohio star block, so if you've never made one before, now you know how to make one. The little addition on the corners is actually just a little twist on it. Most traditional Ohio star blocks just have solid background fabrics here. But anyway, we are well on our way. We are 1/4 of the way done with this block of the month. There is a link below to my blog. You will need to go to my blog to download this month's pattern PDF. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this month's block tutorial. This is a really cute little block design. I just want to remind you of a couple things. If you're just now tuning in, it's not too late to join. You can find links in the description below to the January and February block videos. And on my blog as well, where you will need to go to get this month's pattern, I will have links to those earlier pattern posts as well. So it's not too late to join in. I hope that you're sewing along and you're enjoying it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, share it with a friend, and hit the like button. Thanks so much for stopping by.